Welcome back to Plague Scythe Studios, everyone. Ryan here with IK Multimedia's plugin answer to the world of guitar gear profiling with TONEX Capture. The idea of replicating analog guitar sounds via capture is certainly not a new idea. Kemper has been doing it with profiling for over a decade at this point, and though personally I tend to prefer component-based modeling and being able to interact with individual controls in a more realistic way that is provided by people like Fractal Audio or Line 6 or Neural DSP and their standalone plugins, I also found that when I reviewed this last year, there's some good sounds to be had, and it does a commendable job, especially in the typical use case. Though, as I sort of expected, it doesn't exactly perform as I want it to on some edge cases, and it even has some fundamental quirks in its capturing process and the algorithms that reproduce a lot of these sounds. So when TONEX was announced, at a fraction of what a Kemper or especially a new Neural DSP Quad Cortex costs, I was immediately intrigued for multiple reasons. First of all, from a usability standpoint, as someone who does everything in the box except when it comes to outboard guitar pedals and amplifiers and some specific use cases, this is automatically more attractive to me than having to go out and buy a dedicated hardware unit to do this kind of stuff. Not only is the cost of entry way lower, but it's way easier to stealthily integrate with my pre-existing gear. You don't have to have this thing in 4-cable method all the time. You don't have to break this out every single time that you want to reamp a track through a capture. You just have it in a plug-in format. You don't have to re-record stuff. Just add that to your signal chain and voila, you have a reamp sound. Secondly, I really like the premise of how easy it is to share presets and tone captures on TONEX. Of course, the Kemper Profiler has a similar system as well as Neural DSP where you can upload to Rig Manager for here, and there's like 10,000 plus free profiles available right now. Obviously, TONEX is not at that point yet, but as the user base grows, I think that value proposition is going to keep increasing. And the best part about it for me is that if I wanted to share something I made with someone, say in South America or Europe, they don't have to go out and spend $1,300 to $1,800 on a unit just to be able to use that sound. It's as low as $150 when it comes to cost of entry of this, and you can spend a lot more and potentially get more out of it if that's exactly what you're looking for. But it's pretty obvious looking at the pricing model that the value sweet spots definitely trend towards the lower side, which again is a good thing for cost of entry. So if I wanted to, say, send another studio my sound, it's $150 and they could have access to literally every amp tone in my room, which is pretty great, and vice versa. With that in mind, I'm going to be evaluating TONEX in kind of a similar way as I did the Kemper, where the first half of the video is more focused on the end user experience, the finished tone models, what you hear when just plugging in and playing through one of these presets. Whereas the second half is going to be more focused on the capture side and how it compares to a real amplifier. And I think that's important because there is going to be overlap, of course, but this has a very different value proposition based off of which camp you're in, and the cost of entry isn't all that different between the two. So I think if you have any amplifier or gear that you want to capture, I think it is a little more worth it to just go ahead and step up to the capture tier, as you get the same amount of models included, something like 200, as you would if you didn't spend the extra $100 for capture and you were limited to whatever comes in that edition and what people are uploading based off of their own captures. And that does become a bit of a different balancing act, because when you're just looking at this from a plug-in point of view, you're kind of opening up the criticisms of TONEX to what other plugins are capable of, and this one simply isn't as capable in a lot of ways. Ignoring some simple improvements and stupid oversights that we'll get into in a little bit, comparing this fresh out of the box very much just makes it look like another plugin, and indeed, for an end user who's not capturing their own hardware, that's what it is. And so if you just compare this amplifier model to another JCM 800 or Plexi style amp, maybe it holds up, maybe it doesn't, but it's not really interesting enough in that way, in my opinion, to justify a separate purchase if you already have something that takes care of a lot of this stuff. So looking at it through that lens, let's take TONEX for a quick spin. I have it pulled up here on the desktop app on a Windows 10 machine. May not seem important right now, but that will be valuable context later. And there's really two different ways, I guess a 2A and a 2B technically, to access TONEX. There is the standalone player app, which also has the modeler tab, which we'll talk about when we get into the capture stuff. But as a strict end user, you're basically going to be using this tab exclusively, and on the VST plugin, there is no modeling, so you have to do all the capturing from the desktop, which makes sense because it actually uses a lot of your desktop resources to do so. You can also access most of these captures through Amplitube 5. You need to update both that software and TONEX to the latest versions to be able to do that, but instead of the regular amplifier models, you can just click TONEX in Amplitube 5 and then scroll through the presets that you have here. It's not quite as adjustable as it is in the TONEX player. As with this, you get built-in noise gate you can add. You have pre or post EQ. Would kind of like to have this both pre and post, but for the most part, it's good enough. This can be useful in kind of getting some surgical cuts in mid or treble frequencies that you otherwise couldn't with the built-in tone stack. And you also have some built-in compression and reverb, which can be useful. Most of these captures on the amplifier side of things already have a built-in cabinet, but you can go through, change the presets, or actually go to a virtual speaker simulation where you move microphones, that sort of thing. This seems to be a bit of a Kemper situation, or more accurately, a Kemper pre-merged profile situation. What I mean is, when you capture an amp and cabinet with this, there's no way to separate the two in the same capture. That is to say, if you disable the cabinet block like you would on a regular Kemper profiler, it's a close approximation of having no cab, but it's not the same because you have to measure them both independently to be able to do that, and that's what a merge profiler does. But that doesn't really exist here. So when you change out the cab sounds, it might sound a little weird because it's not the true sound. That is to say, you're going to probably get best results if you stay with the preset cab included, or you use a direct amplifier profile or capture. I'm going to use those two interchangeably. I don't care about the legality. That's the same shit. So sue me, Kemper. I don't care. Whatever the case, it doesn't seem that any of the SE tier captures are of a just baseline amplifier without a cabinet. You know, maybe something that was captured via load box, which we'll explore with my own captures in a bit. But that means that you're going to be kind of limited on functionality when it comes to accurately modeling an amp and cabinet interaction. That's a fairly minor nitpick, though, compared to some other glaring UI and functionality issues. First off, in typical IK fashion, you can't just play the damn thing you bought without being subjected to advertisements for other stuff they want you to buy. It's never enough. It's not enough that they got 150 of your dollars. They want all of it. So that's why you see over in this corner with the Tone Model Collections, we have the British Juice 2. You can buy it now or try it all for a limited amount of time, or you can just try them down here and you're going to get audio dropouts, and that's fine for demo purposes. I'm cool with that. But number one, stop advertising shit in the app that you already bought. That is totally not necessary. You've already got it down here where you don't own the thing, but when you try it, you have audio dropouts. Down here, that's fine. If that pops up and says you don't have this, would you like to upgrade? I don't even care about that so much. But just these stupid little tone collection advertisements, the same thing in Amplitube 5, it drives me nuts. For all the gripes I have about how Neural DSP segments their stuff, at least they don't advertise another plugin while you're playing a different plugin. Secondly, I'm not really crazy about this main UI in general. This start page isn't too hampering, but I feel like depending on what resolution your monitor is, this very much should scale better. I mean, you drag the window, it just changes everything, and that's fine to a certain extent, but I don't need this big of a text on a 1440p screen, and I can imagine it being really annoying on 4K, but they gotta show you the amp picture. So some better scaling here would be very welcome. The much bigger issue is the fact that every time you pull this app up, it doesn't start off pre-filtered in any logical way. What do I mean by that? Well, if we exit out of this tone model collection, you see this little filter here? It doesn't automatically filter out the stuff you don't own. So all of this is wide open. And by the way, if you close it in the VST plugin and open it back up, removes that filter, which just makes my blood boil. But every time you start the app, it's filtered to where you see everything. So if you're looking for a certain amplifier, like, oh, I'd like to try out this OR50, oh shit, I don't actually own it. Why is that there by default? It should show you what you own. You should have to go out of your way to see the stuff you don't, because otherwise you're just shown advertisements every other time you're trying a tone. But the thing that gets me more than all of that combined, I'm wearing a Moist Esports shirt today, so I want to steal one of Charlie's quotes. The thing that really greases my ass is half of the selling point of TONEX is that you can't just capture amplifiers, you can capture pedals as well, which is something that Kemper can't do simultaneously. You can capture a pedal on Kemper, but you can't stack a pedal and an amplifier. Neural DSP Quad Cortex can do that, this cannot. So if we go in here and we filter by just stomp, you can see, oh, cool, you know, they've got Klon captures available. We just go to the stuff that I own, which is ridiculous. I have to do that at all. I've got some of the stuff that I've made. You got, you know, Boss DS1, MT2, cool. Okay, well, what's the first thing you're gonna wanna do if you have stomps and amps available at the same time? Put a stomp in front of an amp, right? Okay, well, let's go back to one of those amplifiers. We'll go ahead and filter that out. This navigation is not the absolute best thing, but we'll suffer through it. Okay, as you see, we've got a few presets that are built with a stomp and an amp. And you can see the amp, you don't really see the stomp though, so that's whatever. Okay, let's just put on a clean Fender amp, and looks like we have an open slot here that a pedal could go, but it's not doing anything. It's not in comp, it's not over here. Am I missing something in the signal chain? I'm right-clicking everywhere. Oh wait, this isn't a bug, this is a feature. So officially, right now, if you want to use a stomp from TONEX in front of an amplifier model from TONEX, you have to have 2 instances of the VST plugin pulled up in whatever audio workstation you're using, which means that in the player, you can't use a stomp and an amp at the same time. What the fuck is that? Beyond the clunky, half-finished look that this gives this product, it's actually detrimental to the user experience, because on desktop especially, if you just play through a fuzz pedal, or you just play through an overdrive pedal, or especially anything that's more extreme than that, it sounds like ass, because you're not supposed to hear just a raw pedal sound. So how could you possibly go through here and listen to this in just a single instance of the player and go, oh yeah, that sounds good? Because it doesn't. It's not going to sound good unless you put it in front of an amplifier. And vice versa, how do you know that these amplifiers react correctly with a different pedal up front? You have to do it in a VST and double stack them, which is just ridiculous that that even launched in this condition. And like I said, you can absolutely see that there appears to be a spot for where this eventually would go, but it's just not there yet. When I was first playing around with this, I thought maybe I'm just overlooking something, I'm being too harsh. Maybe they intend for you to use this in, you know, Amplitube, and that would make sense because they have all their amps and all their pedals there. Okay, but you go there and you can only add a TONEX amp to the amp slot. You can't even add a TONEX pedal, period, let alone a TONEX pedal in front of a TONEX amp. What is going on here? I almost feel bad that IK has to take the brunt of this, because it's not just them, but I am so absolutely sick of stupid, obvious development issues like this making it to the final product on launch day. This is a no-brainer. And even when you read the marketing material, it seems like you should be able to add a pedal in front of an amplifier model in the same instance from day one. This isn't a surprise to anybody. This didn't just go, oh, sorry, we uploaded the wrong, you know, instance of our software. We just had a mix-up. No, they know it doesn't work, and they still put it out anyway, saying, we'll add an update later. Fuck that. That is not acceptable. And I don't blame any individual developer at iCave. Sure, Jerry's sitting there at his desk going, oh, these stupid project managers. I told them we should have shipped with this. Just delay it another month. It's not that hard. I can add it, but give me time. And the, trigger happy stakeholders made him put it out and rush it out anyway. So as a result, this feels like a half-baked product, and it's ridiculous that for the pedal demos in this video, I have to have 2 instances of the shit. But there you go. With that, I cannot recommend anyone buys this until it is feature complete, and that's like bare bones, let alone all the advertisement stuff, which if you can't stand that, then just don't buy it at all. With that out of the way, if that didn't give you an aneurysm, we can actually listen to some of the included sounds of TONEX SE, which again, you have with TONEX Capture if you buy that edition. This will be kind of a no context test, just plugging in, playing a couple of the sounds that are available, some of the models that they give you, and this is kind of a spectrum of what you can expect across different levels of gain and saturation. Without having the actual amplifier rig used to capture these tones with as a reference, it's hard to say, well, this sounded this % accurate, but it's about par for the course of what I expected. It nails some of the harder things to capture about some of those amplifiers, and it's very much in line with Amplitube 5 quality, which is sort of middle of the road, a little bit above average in terms of quality for paid products in my experience, where it doesn't quite nail everything and doesn't maybe get the same sort of power amp compression and a lot of the fine details, but it's mix ready and put next to the real thing. It stands up just fine on a real song. I wouldn't be opposed to using it with that. But again, without having further context, it doesn't really stand out in the crowd. I don't hear that capture of a Dietzel and go, oh yeah, well that's next generation. You know, it sounds very much like something I could have achieved with a freeware version of that if I use the same cabinet. And I think maybe the cabinet simulation is what is partially a bit of a turn off to my ears. It's not the same way I would capture it, and it's going to be subjective in that matter. But the overall amplifier structure sounds right to me. For the most part, it's a pretty similar story when you start stacking overdrives and fuzzes and distortions in front of these amplifiers, whether it be a second instance of TONEX or an integrated overdrive or EQ or something in Amplitube 5. It reacts pretty much the way you would expect, which kind of makes sense. You know, most of this stuff is kind of linear acting up until a certain threshold, and then some things start to get weird. We'll kind of evaluate more extreme settings later on, but if you're just kind of put a fuzz in front of a plexi kind of player, or tube screamer in front of a 5150, or maybe a bit of hard clipping overdrive in front of a Fender amp, it's pretty convincing. The really interesting discussion for this product starts in the modeler tab. Like I said a moment ago, you have to be on the desktop app for this to be accessible. You can't do this through a VST plugin due to how it has to take advantage of your system resources. Speaking of which, the minimum requirements are interesting, because this isn't just like, playing a computer game where it says you have to have this, threshold for a processor and this generation of graphics card at the 60 or 70 tier or higher and this amount of RAM. This actually invokes use of your audio interface as well. So input and output channels become very important. Now, I'll tell you right now, I wouldn't want to use this product with anything lower than the Scarlett 6i6 that I'm using right now. It says you can technically get by with something with 2 inputs and 2 outputs. It says preferably 3. And I would agree with that. 3 for left and right monitor, and then 1 to send to your rig. Most interfaces don't have 3 channels. It's going to be a 4 or a 2 or a 6, right? So something in the 6i6 realm, maybe even a 2i4. And honestly, unless you were planning to never make a multi-mic mix capture, I would prefer 4 inputs on the front panel for my interface, just because you'd have 2 for mics, 1 for your instrument. I could, I guess, route a DI box into one of the rear line inputs, but it just gets a little more convoluted. I like the streamlined nature of this though. So this works. 6i6 is good. Anything in that realm will probably get you going. But as we'll kind of get into in a bit, when you have something like that and you have outboard gear to make your amplifiers work in a reamp application, or especially in a direct recorded application, this isn't even useful. Again, we'll explore that a little bit more. But that's all to say, if you're a student or employee by day and musician by night, and you have a simple little, 2 input, 2 output interface, or something even more simplified and streamlined, then this isn't really going to work for you when it comes to the modeler side of things. And that is one hidden cost of this. Yes, for me, I already had all this stuff. And that's why, versus the Kemper Profiler, this thing absolutely crushes it in terms of dollars spent for the value you get out of it. But if you're coming at this from a clean slate and you were just going to plan on, recording this through SPDIF or the, XLR outputs, and you only have a $100 to $150 interface, this probably isn't going to cut it for you. The hidden costs certainly don't end there, but let's get a little further along in the capturing process first. The next page asks you which instrument you plan to use, guitar or bass. As far as I can tell, the profiling process itself doesn't change that dramatically, but it is important for levels and that sort of thing. So just select whichever one. I only use bass one time in this demo, so you'll definitely be able to hear that. It'll then ask you what tone model you're planning to use. And honestly, I don't know why there's 5 selections, because this thing really shouldn't care. I guess it just is to dummy proof it and tell you exactly what switches and stuff you need. Honestly, there's only really, I guess, 3 different ways you can use this. One is a complete DI method. So that would either be your stomp or an amplifier that's connected to a load box that has a line level output. I'll be doing that first for these initial demonstrations. So with that, I could just take my amplifier output, plug it straight into here, and we've got the line output from amp done. It's basically in, right back to the output. Stomp, same thing. Now, if you didn't have a load box, but you still wanted to capture your amplifier directly so you could use impulse responses and such, this does have a power out option, which then makes this kind of a pass through. And it does the same thing that like the Kemper DI does, where you'd plug a speaker cable into here, speaker cable out going to your cabinet, and then it just takes its own line level tap off of your amplifier. Again, I don't have to do that, but it is an option if you so choose. The mic'd up speaker cab configuration is actually the simplest from the capture box's point of view, as the only thing coming into this is your reamp signal going out to the amplifier. That's it. The mic'd signal will be going directly into your audio interface and maybe, outboard preamps or EQ if you have that in between. But otherwise, you're basically using this as a glorified DI box. Now, the other options basically allow you to say, I have a pedal here. Same thing with this. Otherwise, when you fill out the description of your rig, you'll only see amplifier and cabinet and whatnot. So that's fine. But especially once you look at this little diagram, after having all of your inputs and outputs labeled properly of where you're going to be plugging stuff in, you kind of come to the realization that if I've already got a load box and a reamp box, and I've been reamping amplifiers for years, this thing isn't doing jack shit. You see, the TONEX software has no way of knowing what you're plugged into. You're just telling it where your sources are, so it doesn't actually know whether I'm passing a signal through this box or not. This is not really an intelligent audio interface. There's no USB port on this thing. It's just input comes in, output comes out. So in this instance, when it's just acting like a glorified reamp box, well, I could just plug into my actual reamp box instead from Radial that does all the transformer isolation and the impedance matching, and done. That's what I normally do. I've not actually experimented with doing it this way, but I imagine you're going to get pretty similar results if your input-output signals are the same if you were to do it here. I'm not saying it was a bad decision. I'm glad they included this thing because not everybody has that stuff. I totally get that. So I think it was the right thing to do to charge $100 and include this. I'm just saying maybe it would have also made sense to maybe make a $50, $75 discount version that unlocks the modeler page and you don't have to buy this, because this is just kind of a waste of space and actually introduces the opportunity for noise to escape into the signal path. So in the configuration I had it for capturing my amplifiers directly, basically selected whichever amp I had that was going to the sewer reactive load, purely silent at that point. I have a line level TRS cable coming from my audio interface going into the line input here. I've got the 2 amp instrument cable going to the front end of an amplifier or whatever combination of stuff I have. And then I had a line level TRS cable coming from the serial reactive load going in the from amp. And I told it this was line out. I could control all that volume from multiple places. Input, output, as seen here. Input 2 out from this thing going into my audio interface. Input 1 was the guitar, still monitoring through the monitors. Sounds more complicated than it actually is. If you ever reamp stuff, it's really not that bad. On to the next page is where you start to check your signal level, and this is where stuff starts to get a little goofy. Again, I understand the intent, and it makes it more universal for whatever hardware configuration the user has. But to achieve the correct input levels, as far as TONEX is concerned, I have to increase the preamp of my audio interface significantly compared to how I would normally play it. Now, the way I normally use it is plug straight in, turn the preamp volume all the way down, and just use the instrument setting on that input. I've done dozens of tests because I'm neurotic about this kind of stuff, but that is identical to the volume, the output level, the tonal quality coming out of a guitar raw. I mean, that's why it's the instrument input. You shouldn't need preamp gain at that point. And it's good. It's a great thing. It's a good design by Focusrite. And actually, when I take it out of the line level and transform it back down to an impedance matched version of that signal, I just have to boost the output by 6 dB and it's the same level. So that's how I have my reamp set up. And that's the way I wanted to keep it here. But it kind of yells at you and says, oh, it's not loud enough for us. Dude, I've been making VST videos for how long? And it's worked fine so far, and it sounds right. But whatever, we'll turn up the input level to get it a little hotter. On the next page, though, they ask you to do basically the exact opposite on this input of the TONEX capture box, where you attenuate it until it sounds correct, as in it would sound the same as if you plugged your guitar straight in through the amplifier. I get what they're doing. They're front end loading the signal with more output, hopefully reducing the noise floor, and then, you compensate for it here. So it does result in a bit of a quieter signal than if you did it the other way around. I have confirmed that, but what is dead silent compared to that is just using my reamp box. So it's kind of annoying. I'd say some of that is attributed to this being active, with this 9-volt power supply and being, hooked into a mess of other cables and stuff. So that's a little weird. That's the way I captured everything in these demonstrations, just because it's the way they recommend, and it's probably the way you'll do it as well. The next step asks you to check the return levels. I promise we're getting close to the capture part. This feels like forever the first time you do it. So whether you're coming in from this input from a DI application, or you've got a line signal coming from a microphone, you'll want to adjust that to make sure that's in its sweet spot. Again, just trying to balance signal to noise, making sure that it doesn't clip the input. But the really interesting thing here is that in addition to the live input where you can, play your guitar, you hear the signal coming out and monitoring all that, you can also play these little DI snippets included in the box. And they all have a kind of a different sounding guitar, different passages and phrases and melodies and stuff. Some of them sound, down-tuned, and it gives you a pretty wide gamut of things to sample your amplifier with, even if you don't actually have that guitar. This kind of functionality at this point of the process alone is already brilliant. I think this is a great inclusion. The only thing I wish we could add, hopefully would be doable in a future update, would be the ability to add our own DIs, even if it's limited to 30 seconds or whatever. Because I have probably a better part of an hour's worth of guitar playing that I've collected from videos over the years past of my own stuff, and it'd be really helpful to hear what does my EMG equipped guitar sound like? What does my 8-string guitar sound like through this, or my Telecaster? When you're using your own guitars, it's a bit of a different thing, especially to hear your own playing versus this kind of stuff. So that would be awesome if I could do that without having to virtualize an input and output on my audio interface and go through some weird stuff to make that work in live input, but already a cool inclusion. After all that setup time, we finally made it to the capture page. And in TONEX's defense, it's not that much quicker setting up the Kemper profiler if you're using a microphone, or especially if you're trying to do a dual mic setup, because this doesn't have 2 mic inputs, so you gotta go through a mixer and all this stuff. So this isn't that much worse, but it is a little bit more of a headache. So if you're gonna capture stuff, I definitely recommend that you do it like I did and do a lot of stuff back to back while you already have the mess out, because a mess it does make. But you'll also want to do them back to back for other reasons we'll get into, not least of which is the amount of time it takes to capture. I've yet to use a quad core text, but in my understanding, both it and the Kemper Profiler, certainly this one, have got this thing beat in terms of the capture time. I mean, this is negligible compared to how long this takes. This is like go make a sandwich and come back and it's probably done. This is go play a boss on whatever game you're playing and come back and maybe it's done. And that doesn't even get into the later process. But I think it's fine and actually preferred. This is far more exhaustive and actually saves you from a secondary step, which is only sort of required, but it's definitely required on the Kemper Profiler. So you don't actually end up spending that much more time at all in the capture process here, and I think it is better as a result. If you've ever heard the noises the Kemper makes during its profiler process, you're going to hear some familiar sounds here with a bunch of pops and things that sound like it's shooting an impulse response and, you know, some weird like modulation noise that I guess it's extracting drive parameters and, you know, frequency responses and all that sort of stuff. But interestingly enough, once it gets to just under the halfway point, you start hearing something that I talked about over a year ago, and thankfully somebody listened. Indeed, after all the strange beeps and boops TONEX makes up until the halfway point, some real instrument sounds start. All those aforementioned DIs you could play around with, those are part of the capture suite. From a low-end, chuggy baritone guitar to that Strat on its neck pickup to some, you know, high kind of picking sweep action to power chords, about every kind of sample of a playing style you can imagine is in there. And somebody was talking about that over a year ago, I think. I don't remember who. And in total fairness, owners of Kempers who have had this device for way longer than me have been suggesting that for literally years. Why is there not some guitar sound in the profiling process? To me, it's probably because Kemper didn't think of it and they're just stubborn and say, no, it's a stupid idea, it's not needed, it's fine. Except it is, because we're gonna make you do the profile refinement, which if you don't need it to get the profile, then the profile refinement shouldn't be needed. But by its very existence, you're admitting that you don't have a good data set from the original profile, so you have to add more. But refining the profile actually introduces opportunity for error and it can make the whole sound less accurate and overall worse. And it kind of depends on the input of your guitar. So if you refine the process with a different guitar than you actually are going to play it with and it can sound different, it's just maddening. Why don't they just put in stuff like this into the profiler? The fact that something like that has not been introduced on Kemper yet, and it took IK Multimedia, of all companies, to come up with that, tells me this is either incapable, and we need a Kemper 2 because it's locked in firmware and it would break everything if you added that, or they're so caught up on, you know, their own algorithm and patented processes that they, again, just think it's a stupid idea because they didn't think of it first. But I think the proof is in the pudding. I think this capture process is far better than what the Kemper's doing, hands down, because when this thing is done, when it's done with its training and you get the final product, it sounds so much closer on the first try than this Kemper ever has making any profile. I always had to refine this thing and basically had to come up with my own DI input to get it close. And I could have done a better job after hearing what they're doing here on TONEX. And I guarantee you, all the people that are selling premium profiles have come up with their own DI solution that is consistent from run to run to get basically the same results they are here. So Kemper, quit being so stubborn and admit that there is an opportunity for improvement on this process. This proves it. Now, the reason I'm not really concerned with the capture time on TONEX is because it pales in comparison to the next step, which is training. Now, you got to give it to Kemper for having such a fast turnaround on the profile. When it's done capturing, it's a few seconds, it's ready to go. And I guess because it's doing some more relatively basic algorithms like wave shaping and trying to fit some of those EQ differences onto base models as we postulated in its review, but it turns it around and it gets pretty good results, all things considered. This, on the other hand, is not just strictly algorithm and baseline modeling. This is, for all intents and purposes, machine learning. And no, I'm not stooping to the marketing bullshit and labeling this as AI, artificial intelligence. It can listen to your rig just like a human does and infer an outcome. No, that's absolute garbage. This is machine learning from neural networking, if anything. And if that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry. It doesn't mean shit to half the companies that market the stuff either, because they have their definitions totally wrong, and it's just easier for the masses to understand. This is not inferring anything. It's not taking limited inputs and, trying to extrapolate, predict the future like humans do. It's not reasoning on an emotional or even a logical level. It's just taking a huge data set and with raw computational power, slamming it up against the wall and concatenating all these inputs and outputs until it trains a model that reaches some level of accuracy that it's shooting for. And that's where this gets interesting, because a Kemper profile is a Kemper profile is a Kemper profile. It's the same process, the same algorithm, all that. This, even with the same capture, can be trained in 3 different qualities. You don't have quality modes on the Kemper, it's just the Kemper quality. On this, you have default, fast, and advanced. Now, all the captures I made for this video were trained under the advanced accuracy level, maximum accuracy, and longer training time. Because if I'm going through the trouble of setting all this stuff up anyway, I'm not going to skimp on quality just to save, 15 minutes maybe per capture? And that's just a guesstimation. So I'm not going to do any default versus fast versus advanced trainings. It's kind of hard to even do that because you got to recapture stuff anyway. I'm interested in what is the best thing this can output. And again, if I'm going to go through all that trouble anyway, that means I'm looking to use these captures in kind of a final product, whether it be an album or just a demo. I want it to sound as good as possible. So I'm not even going to look at those other ones as long as my system can handle it. And it can. However, it's not exactly like I have a flagship, supercomputer. But at least according to the Steam hardware survey, my CPU configuration is very much average, if not a little bit above, and my GPU still dwarfs what most people are playing games with. And the advanced algorithm takes 35, 40-ish minutes. I've never actually clocked it, but suffice to say that it's a good thing I was playing Metroid Dread over the break when I was doing this, because this would basically eat up every computer resource. And I'd go play that a while, come back, and it's not done yet, go play a little bit more. And I mean that literally. This thing would absolutely max out my GPU. So if that's what advanced mode does to a 5-year-old flagship 6-core, 12-thread, pushing 5 gigahertz CPU, and at one point, what was the second fastest GPU in the world a couple years ago, I'm going to guess this is going to be nearly impossible to run on, say, that aforementioned work or school laptop, which is why the default and fast parameters exist. Maybe advanced is worth it for some people if they don't mind letting it train for 3 or 4 hours, but it's kind of brutal on this as is. And maybe some of the more recent Mac Pros and stuff would be able to churn through this a little quicker, but it's kind of crazy how much computational power this takes. Again, for my use case, I think it's worth the advanced just to be sure that doesn't, have any potential drawback on the quality. And as we'll see in some of the other demonstrations, even on advanced, it doesn't get everything right. So I would definitely not want to skimp any further than you need to. If your system can handle default, try advanced. And I would go with that if possible. When you start the training process, you might see a warning box pop up like this. And in this case, I had no signal, so it's just going to error and stop. But you also might see something to the effect of noise was detected. We're still going to keep processing, but the quality might suffer. If you don't see that, more than likely you're going to get a pretty good representation of the actual product. If you do, though, it might still work, but there's probably going to be some oddities. It might sound right in the frequency response, but there might be some other things going on. We'll certainly explore some examples where that definitely was the case. You go through the next couple of tabs to review and change the input gain level in case you didn't get it quite right the first time. You can skin it to make it look like whichever favorite amp head you like, name it, add all the descriptions and whatnot. You save it and you go back to the player and voila, it shows up. Of course, it's not going to be the first thing that I have here, but if I go down to the most recent things I made, you ought to see some of the profiles or captures that I made for the video. And so for our first direct comparison between TONEX and the amplifiers they were based on, let's listen to a range of gain and distortion textures with my Mesa Boogie Mark IV on the Rhythm 2 channel, the Cherry Tone Gargoyle with the Hot Mod V2 on the high channel, and the single rectifier on a tight Fortin 33 type mode. Comparing these direct captures while using the same impulse responses as the real DI amps, this is like 99% the same. There are some very, very minor differences you can pick up on if you focus in, and then you kind of can't unhear them, but it's pretty damn commendable what they've been able to achieve here, and I am thoroughly impressed with the quality of these captures. In a mix, by the time everything is going through bus compression and some transient manipulation and all that stuff, there's no way. There's no way you could tell the difference between the real amp and this. And I'm hard-pressed telling the difference just listening to it and soloing back and forth between the two tracks, though it is a little bit possible. The Mark IV, I'm not really hearing much of anything in that particular playthrough that makes it really obvious, but in going back and forth between the real amp and the software, I could hear some of the differences that are really audible in the Gargoyle and the single rectifier. So in the single rectifier, I think the gain structure is damn near perfect. It definitely has that same texture. There just seems to be a little bit more low-end initial emphasis on the real amplifier. This very well could be a symptom of how the power amplifier transformer is reacting to some of that low-end negative feedback, but especially on the low-end chugs, you can hear this swell, a very initial peak of low-end content that kind of dies down, and it seems a little more static and compressed and ever-present on the model and doesn't really move that much with whatever input it's receiving. But it's really close, and again, by the time you multi-band compress something like this to tame some of that stuff, I doubt that it's really going to matter. The thing that I heard more pronounced on the Gargoyle, and I think this is happening to some extent across all the models, is something I would describe as persistence of transients. And this starts to get into some really nerdy segmentation of distortion discussions. And this just might be the finest example I've heard of this, where basically everything else is damn near identical, but this one aspect of the distortion sound. And to me, it's one of those pillars that separate a great amp modeling platform to one of, say, last generation, because you can very much hear this symptom in your Pod X3s and your HDs, or especially older products. Basically, the frequency responses, the overall tightness, everything sounds dead on the real amplifier. But the best way I can describe it is, especially on those palm mutes, some of that high-end frequency content, the punch, the transients, seems to last longer on the real amplifier. So you really get kind of a shh in the pick when it digs through the string. There'll be a lot of onomatopoeias in this video, so buckle up. On the TONEX Capture though, that initial punchy, scrapey pick attack just decays immediately and kind of falls from a shing sound to shklunk. Like it's very clunky and almost plasticky sounding. That's the kind of texture I think of when people say, well, this plug-in or this pedal sounds like plastic. It's kind of that, where it's like, it sounds like your strings are dead, but they're not. You have the initial attack that sounds really good, but then it doesn't really resolve correctly and doesn't sustain for as long. So especially on those fast pick portions, whereas the real amplifier was much more defined and sharp and had that hot rodded plexi thing going on, the other one sounded a little digital by comparison. When you really focus in, and again, I'm talking that last 1% to 2% here. Otherwise, it is so close that I really have struggled to tell the difference. Now, in that capture session, I managed to squeeze out quite a bit of distortion out of the Gargoyle and the rectifier without running into any issues. I didn't get any noise warnings. You know, the Gargoyle has like 4 gain stages at this point. It's pushing a lot of gain. The rectifier is essentially almost a 5 gain stage thing if you want to count the pedal. And that was, you know, putting out quite a bit of output, and it's tight and chuggy and all that stuff, and it worked out fine. I started running into some issues though once I threw the cabinet and microphone into the situation. So with this, I'm going to show you my initial attempt at capturing my rectifier going through the top greenback speaker on this 2x12 Marshall through a cam crystal microphone. And I think the issue was maybe noise stack up, where the preamp is adding a little bit, the microphone's picking up some ambient room stuff, all that sort of thing. And it resulted in absolutely hilarious failure. I've never heard the Kemper ever be this off and this terrible. And the bad part is you don't really have any way of knowing until you train the thing. So this is one bad thing about the extended capture and a really extended training period, is you're kind of rolling the dice every time. And there's no obvious tell like, oh, I clipped the input, or oh, it made this sound, I better start over. It seemed like a normal capture. And indeed, I've had more successful captures with crazier setups. So I don't really know. This is what you get though if you try to capture a Fortin 33 into a single rectifier, into a 2x12, into a condenser microphone, and standard preamp. I couldn't even hazard a guess what the hell happened there. If there's some noise suppression thing going on in the background of this TONEX training or what. I've never heard anything quite that wrong before. However, I was able to get a more stable result by capturing the Fortin 33 separately, which kind of seemed like a waste of time because it's a freaking Fortin pedal. It's one EQ curve and fixed output, whatever. But I did it. and then captured the amplifier and cabinet and microphone and all that separately. And that seemed to work out just fine. Once again, heard some of those same things I talked about with the DI amps, but by the time you put it through a cabinet and all those things start to kind of converge onto one another, it's a lot harder to hear those differences. And again, I would say this is really damn close, if not within margin of error of individual impulse response shots you would get out of this cabinet. A few little things I can nitpick, but it's good enough. Let's put our end user cap back on for a moment, and let's say you've gone through and captured all the amps you want or downloaded a few, and you got something that sounds really good on its own and it's close, but you need to tweak it a little bit. Maybe the amplifier is a little too bright, or like that last capture I did, it's just a little too spiky for a mix, maybe even too high gain. Well, just like the Kemper Profiler, none of these controls are modeling the real control on the amp, because this isn't an amp model, it's a capture, and all these things are kind of built in different places of that capture to get it close, but it's not going to react the same way. The gain pot doesn't have a bright cap on it, so you're not going to tighten up as you lower it. It's basically just the input control before it goes into the amp model itself. The bass middle treble, it's sort of tone stackish in its behavior, but not really as well, and acts more of like a parametric EQ. In addition to that, you don't know, at least TONEX doesn't know, where it started. So if you have the mids completely nuked on an amplifier, you can still turn the mids down more, which you can't do on a real amp. So the goal here was, how close can I get the TONEX model, that original capture, to sound versus a tweaked version of what I just captured there. So if I change the amplifier settings, how close will this allow you to get without recapturing the amp? Because for a lot of people, you don't have that opportunity, right? If you downloaded someone else's capture, that's it. That's what you got to work with. So how close can you get without sounding artificial to that initial amplifier capture? And it's not too bad, but it doesn't really work as good as a component-based model, which I think we all should know going in. Up to this point, I haven't exactly challenged TONEX with any complicated pedal circuits. I wouldn't consider a clean EQ boost a particularly hard thing to model when most EQ match software can do that as well. But we need to see what it can do with more traditional pedals of the overdrive and distortion and preamp categories. And there is good news and bad news here. The good news is rather obvious in that if you look through the catalogs of pedal options they give you, it probably shouldn't come as a major shock that more traditional hard and soft clipping pedals sound pretty good through this. There's 1,000 models at the Klon that you can buy. There's, OCD stuff. There's the Marshall Drive Master, Shred Master, Governor, Max on OD808, Distortion Plus, that sort of stuff. In my experience, most of that stuff out of the box sounds good. And anything that uses like transistor clipping within a certain threshold, basic preamp things, hard clipping like DOD 250, those sort of things are going to generally perform really well. Even dark glass, MOSFET and hard clipping stages daisy chained together, they sound pretty convincing. So whether you want to clone a guitar or bass preamp pedal, or you want to stack a virtualized version of your favorite modified hard clipper in front of another instance of TONEX, or in this instance, someone else's plugin, you're probably going to have pretty good results, but you might need to tweak the output volumes a little. Obviously, with reamping straight into the interface versus the software, you might have some signal level differerences. So if you end up doing that, especially if you're comparing, make sure the signal coming out of the pedal stage is identical before you compare them. Otherwise, you're listening to totally different levels of saturation and it's no longer one for one. This is the part where the not so good news starts. And to be fair, I'm not terribly let down here because it's not shocking that Kemper doesn't really perform much better in these applications either. I'd be curious to hear how the Neural DSP Quad Cortex handles it. So if you've had experience with that, I'd love to hear from it. But fuzzes and just full-blown, highly filtered distortion on top of distortion tones, they don't really work. This doesn't cut it. And I'm not shocked because there is a lot of noise involved, but I think this is another one of those things that, like, profiling, capturing, they need to figure this out, because until then, the really crazy guys that stack all these pedals on top of one another will always see this kind of software and hardware solution as an afterthought. It's just not for them. It doesn't even get close to what, a stacked fuzz face or big muff can do in front of an already fuzzy tube amplifier. And this just puts more ammunition into those arguments. It really did not perform well with the fuzz pedals I gave it. And even though it got kind of close on a stacked HM2 style pedal in front of the valve state, it was still missing a lot of marks, just like the gargoyle comparison did, but just amplified like 100-fold. Those issues with persistence, where frequency content would be there and then kind of cut off with every pick attack, it was kind of flipped on its head here, where I was getting kind of a hung, 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 very punchy, low and heavy vocal growl, but then would decay quickly. And then on the capture, it was kind of this flat, no transient, no punch, ha, 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 ha. It was terrible. Absolutely sounds unusable. And it's not the first time I've heard that behavior out of software fuzzes or stack distortion, because I just don't think they have the resolution or the complexity in their algorithms to really detect those kind of differences. Ultimately, TONEX shares the same fate as a lot of other capture and profiling units do, in that fuzzes and these extreme distortions have no subtlety whatsoever. It is full-blown one thing or the other. The high end is all wrong, the low end is all wrong. It's static and disgusting sounding in a non-musical way, and there's just so much nuance to something like that Pelletar germanium with a germanium boost in front of a mixed fuzz face and big muff circuit that it just does not even get close on. And even some of the more streamlined circuits, it doesn't sound right, especially in front of another amplifier. So that's it for the testing that I conducted for this video. Hardly exhaustive, but I think it paints a pretty decent picture of what this thing is capable of. I'm not exactly interested in something that can tone match a clean amp. I can tone match clean amps to other clean amps pretty easily. I'm more interested in what software can do to capture a really complex distortion profile of something that you don't run across every day and that you can transport from one computer to the next. And in the typical use cases of most amplifiers, I think this does a really commendable job. And for most pedals, for that matter, I think it does a pretty decent job. You start getting into the more extreme stuff, and just like some of the products that came before it, it starts to fall apart at the seams. Not terribly shocking, but maybe a little disappointing in that, they probably didn't account for that in their data sets. Now, I don't think it's a completely lost cause. Maybe eventually we'll see something that can handle these higher noise floors, because that's just part of it. If you're going to play these ridiculous pedals and amps and crank it to 11 and have these crazy wall of sound synth-like square wave stuff going on, that's just what you're going to get. And I think until we can sort through that data and make a model out of it, then you're not going to get 100% of guitar players on board on this technology. In the meantime, though, it does a pretty good job, and for most guitar players, I think you're going to get pretty damn good results out of it. I cannot recommend this to anyone right now in its current state if you have any interest in stomp pedals, because you can't use them in the player on their own. It's stupid. But if you're willing to overlook that for a moment and buy into the promise that it will be updated one day, and I do not recommend anyone buys anything based on promises, but assuming you're okay without it, then this might be a good alternative to a Kemper Profiler or a Quad Cortex if you're just going to use it in that way. Just like previous profiling products, this cannot capture time-based effects like modulation, delay, reverb, whatever. But if you're a VST plugin user, you can find a lot of good stuff like that that's free, or you probably already own it. And the $150 to $250 to capture those other analog tones makes a lot more sense, I think, than spending better part of $1,500 to $2,000 on a unit that just does that, especially if you're only going to use it for that. So I look forward to seeing this thing be developed a little bit more, and especially being able to use the damn thing as advertised. But overall, not a bad start. And I kind of wish maybe other brands would have taken the helm on this. Honestly, I think Line 6 could do something similar and maybe do a bit of a better job based off of what I've heard on some of their most recent products. But I'm glad someone's taken the initiative. So if you have any other questions or comments, as always, please leave them down below. If you'd like to see this compared to other things, let me know. I'm not particularly interested in a Kemper versus Bias Effects versus Real Amp versus the, I don't know. It doesn't quite scratch the same itch as component modeling or some of the direct, like-for-like comparisons, but maybe there's something valuable to pull from that. But otherwise, let me know down below, and we'll see you next time. Bye.